So next is this bonus video that I'm going to include as part of the Thrive University online training. Now that we've talked about module 10 and 11, the 5 fears and 5 risks, we now are going to put together a presentation that's just me doing the 5 fears, 5 risks presentation. This is the first meeting of the 3-step process. 5 fears, 5 risks is an emotional connection and getting to the heart of the matter kind of presentation that also allows us to educate consumers in the first meeting about the top 5 risks they should mitigate. Now, not only does it teach them about the top 5 risks to mitigate, it starts off by talking about the 18 risks possible and then narrowing it down. These are the top 5. And so I'm going to present the 5 fears, 5 risks video in a platform that follows this video here, this introduction video, that will allow you to just utilize that video live with your client, where I will ask questions. You can pause the video, and then you can excerpt their answers and try to get into an emotional connection conversation with them. And then once you get through the getting to the heart of the matter and then talking about the 5 things that keep them up at night, the 5 fears, and making that emotional connection, speaking the survival instinct that really reels them into an emotional conversation with you, then it flips to the 5 risks, and it's identifying the 18 risks, narrowed down to the top 5, and every retirement plan should work on mitigation of these 5 risks. And so we educate then in the last part, and then we finish it with saying, this is what we do. We do a 5-dimensional test on Social Security, a 3-dimensional test on pensions. We do a divide and conquer strategy to create both defensive and offensive strategies for income and growth. We create promise-based income versus risk-based income, and we chase more of the portfolio with equities outside the red zone in this process. And then we talk about how we collect the data and how we then present the reports. And so I'm going to do this session, this 5 fears, 5 risks session, live on your behalf. This is something you can play again live with the client. If you're interested in purchasing this slide deck, it's available for $250. You can simply do that by calling 515-298-4748, and Michelle Gephardt is the person that you want to talk to. You can also email us at support@thriveincome.com, support@thriveincome.com. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'd encourage you to use this video also to create your knowledge base on how to use the magic words to talk about this in your first planning meeting, and purchase the slide deck for your own particular use. You can also change that slide deck with your logos and with your disclosures, whatever are necessary to modify this to make it more user-friendly for your environment. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy this bonus video. Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Today we're going to talk about an innovative process that allows you to retire with confidence. We thank your financial advisor for having you participate in today's webinar. We are going to hold up a brief disclaimer for you to review. I'll hold it for a brief moment, and we'll begin shortly. In order to get to know you better, we're going to ask a series of questions that are important to us. And so the first question I'm going to ask, and then I'll pause for a moment. I'd ask the financial professional to pause the video and then take time to dialogue the question with the audience, and then start the video again in between each of these questions. So this is the part we call getting to the heart of the matter. Here's the first question. Where are you from, and what was it like growing up? What was the most important lesson you learned about money growing up? What is the hardest lesson you've had learning about money? What's the best lesson you've had about money? What would you do with your time if no one paid you? A little commentary on this question. This question is about when you think about retirement and you think about how you're going to spend your time. What we have discovered is that not only is it important to make sure that we have a good money plan, a good income flow, a good liquidity flow, and a good growth portfolio for the future, but it's equally as important for retirees to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, to feel purpose and meaning. It's not just 100% about a life of leisure. We find that people need to be thinking about, as they give up their positions and their jobs and their professions, oftentimes we will see a loss of identity, and we'll see a lot of emotional despair with some folks. So it's really important as we think about retirement to consider what would we do with our time when we're not being paid, but we're still feeling the meaning in life, and we're feeling that we're engaging in life, and that we have a positive impact. So what would you do with your time if no one paid you? Is there something important about your money that your advisor would not know if they didn't ask? In retirement, how much of your income is okay at risk? And let me phrase this question a second way. Let's define income allocation of your portfolio between promise-based income resources and risk-based income resources. If you had your choice between promise-based income and risk-based income, assuming performance was not challenged or performance was not lost, which types of income would you prefer? Promise-based income or risk-based income? In retirement, after we've allocated the dollars necessary for income, we have additional dollars left there for liquidity and long-term growth. How much of those long-term growth assets also are you okay having at risk? In other words, would you have a portion of them very safe, a portion of them moderately at risk, and a portion of them very risky? On a scale of 1 to 10, please define what risk tolerance level on what percentage of those long-term growth assets. What we find in retirement, after doing what we do now for 31 years with retirees, we've identified 5 major fears that retirees have that seem to keep them up at night or get them to be thinking about the things that are challenges as they approach retirement. And someone identified them here. The first one is the fear of running out, outliving their money. There are some folks out there that have a much higher net worth of value, and we find that rather than the fear of running out, maybe it's the fear that something catastrophic could happen that would force them to change or reduce their lifestyle. So maybe it's the fear of making a change to their lifestyle, not necessarily running out of money. I have a story that goes with this. I remember I have a client, and his name is Joe. Joe owned a manufacturing plant. He was in Manhattan, New York City, and he had sold his manufacturing plant 55 to a buyer, and the payments that that buyer was going to make over the next 10 years was Joe's intention for retirement income for the first 10 years of his life. Our retirement income planning that we did for Joe was to represent what happened after the 11th year and beyond. Now, I remember being in Costa Rica at a hotel, getting ready to leave my room to go ziplining with a group of people, when the phone in my hotel room rang. I answered the phone, and it was Joe. And Joe was just retired, had purchased a $750,000 motorhome, was sitting in a beautiful RV park in Sun City, Arizona, and it was October of '08. We'd had 5 tragic days of the market where the market had dropped 1,000 points a day, shutting the market off each of those days, and it didn't appear as though there was any end in sight to the catapult of the market. And the conversation began something like this from Joe. Curtis, I started the week worth $100 million, and the way things are going, it'll be lucky if I'm worth $50 million at the end of the week. Let me tell you about Joe. Joe was not worried about running out of money. Joe was not worried about eating potatoes. Joe was worried about the catastrophic change to the expected lifestyle that Joe would have during his retirement. And I know that's an extreme case that I'm using as a story, but I could make that story at any income level, at any asset level, even if the client has no fear that they'll run out. Many may have a fear that they're not able to maintain that lifestyle. So one or the other, this question of do I have enough always seems to come up. The second bullet that I want to talk about is the control of money. And unfortunately, too many people have something that we call the illusion of control. They perceive that their assets stuck away in certain types of investments are both generating income and also liquid, but they really haven't considered how much of their dollars based on a safe withdrawal rate can actually be utilized for discretionary liquidity versus those dollars that have to be held hostage to provide that performance rate to generate that income. That's a safe expectation as a withdrawal rate that will last a lifetime. So control of the money is something that we definitely want to talk about. Rising inflation. Inflation's a fact of life, and most people understand this, and of course we have to understand there are different levels of inflation for various segments of our income flow, such as our medical, the assets and income that we need for medical costs and medical premiums. That might inflate differently than, say, a regular living costs. And so we have to be able to, in our programming, facilitate the appropriate inflation level for the subset of that income flow that income flow is generated for. The next one is leaving a legacy. Now, as I mature in the retirement industry, what I'm finding is that more and more people are fearful that maybe they don't have enough, and so the idea of leaving a legacy seems to be less popular as it relates to kids and to charities, just because the fear of, I just need to make sure that me and my spouse, we have enough. However, the point that I want to make here with the issue of legacy has to do with protecting the surviving spouse. We're finding that too many decisions are being made by one spouse or the other, and wrong Social Security elections are being made that really cost that surviving spouse thousands of dollars. Wrong pension elections for those that are lucky enough to have a pension are costing their spouses thousands of dollars. And these bad decisions are then creating a catapult negative impact on that surviving spouse and their cash flow and lifestyle. And so not only do we want to take care of both spouses while they're both alive, but we equally want to be sure that we're protecting that surviving spouse until that surviving spouse has passed away as well. So leaving a legacy is about, and first and foremost, the surviving spouse. Now, generally speaking, as a couple, men and women are married or together at similar ages, and just by demographics and gender, we understand that men generally die more quickly than women, and so this really becomes a huge woman's issue. We have to focus on this for our spouses. And finally, the next of the 5 bullets here that are major fears that people have is an investment mistake. And the reason that we are concerned about this, they're logical. The stories that come out in the media of bad folks in the industry or managing people's money like Bernie Madoff and others, it causes the consumer not to actually know who to trust. There's a fear factor that says, how do I know that I can trust this person or that person? And that's a reality. And for those of us that are not in the financial industry, we can appreciate those that feel in a situation where they really don't know the answers, they need help, but they just don't know if the person that they have selected has their best interests at heart. So we're just going to acknowledge that that's a reality, and we need to say this to you. This investment mistake issue is a two-pronged issue. See, if I don't know who to trust, and there's 100+ moving parts in retirement, and I go home and try this alone, guess who makes the mistake now? Well, now it becomes the consumer, the retiree, that makes the mistake because they procrastinate the decision to pick somebody, and it is them now that go home and make the mistake. So here's I think the most important thing that we want to say here with regards to this bullet point is do not go home and try this alone. Whether it's the advisor that you first selected or if it's a different advisor, by all means, please find somebody that you believe that you can trust and then trust them and do not go home and attempt doing a retirement plan without an expert helping you. This is about also mitigating risk next, and there's a brochure that your financial advisor can provide to you. It's called the Danger Zone, 18 Risks of Retirement that can derail your retirement. This 18 risk booklet was inspired by my work at the American College of Financial Services and the Retirement Income Certified Professionals designation. 42 academics, including myself, put together. And the 42 academics had identified 18 risks in retirement. And so though we're going to talk next about the 5 risks to mitigate, we'd like each and every pre-retiree or retiree to understand what all 18 of those risks really are, so that if we're working with you on a plan, that we can, your advisor can focus specifically on those risks applicable to you and your concerns. And our goal is to structure a plan for you that will alleviate as many fears as possible while allowing you to refire with confidence. So I'm actually changing the vernacular here from retire to refire. Not to just retire, but to refire. The word retire has a negative connotation to it. If I were to retire the tires on my car, they're going to the boneyard. Well, that doesn't represent us when we retire, that we're done, that we're finished, or that we're winding down. It actually means that we're actually refiring to the next phase of life. It's a change of engagement not yet done. It's working for significance and things that really matter more. Attitude of abundance over scarcity. It's important that we pause a minute to talk about the attitude of scarcity and the attitude of abundance. This is really not about dollar bills in the bank. This is about whether or not we have a state of mind of being in a place of abundance, feeling safe, feeling confident, feeling sure as we cross the threshold of working years to retirement years, where instead of accumulating money, maybe we have to start distributing money in order to make the money last. Sometimes consumers come into our financial practices, they have expectations and assumptions that need to be modified, and a series of disciplines that have to be agreed to during a discovery process that set the specifications for the analytics and the calculations that we're going to draft. And in order for the plan to work, we have to have discussions about safe withdrawal rates and longevity dates and what possibilities of one spouse living longer by a period of time than another. And so certain things have to be established in order to set proper expectations and testing, so that when we provide the analytics, the consumer, the pre-retiree, retires with a significant amount of confidence. And if an advisor is so worried about getting the business that they're willing to sacrifice the disciplines with the consumer and not necessarily tell them what they need to hear, but tell them what they want to hear and assure them that things are just fine, you know, that client, that retiree will retire with confidence, living in a place of an attitude of abundance. But the first time the market misbehaves and things start to go awry, suddenly that retiree is going to go from a place of abundance to scarcity. And so will the advisor managing that portfolio. So it's really important that we find advisors that have the courage to tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear, and establish these principles and disciplines in a way that make the program and the planning safe and secure, and one that keep us in a place of abundance, even if it means, as we're telling our advisors, the movie that we play in our mind of what retirement looks like. Our advisor's job is to match our resources, both our income resources of Social Security and pensions and our asset resources, and then play the movie in the mind about the date we're going to retire, how long we're going to live, and what's a safe withdrawal rate, and all the different factors of tax drag and inflation drag and fee drag, and make sure that there's not a significant risk that this client is going to have to fail. And so it's really important that we follow these principles, these disciplines, and your advisor involved in this program has been specially equipped and educated to focus on those disciplines in a way that they'll have the courage to tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. And occasionally that may require our consumer, our retiree or pre-retiree, to reboot the movie in their mind. Maybe they have to work longer and save more. Maybe they can retire when they want to, but maybe their cash flow streams will need to be less, or they won't be able to do as many things as they wanted. And each pre-retiree and retiree has to make those kind of value decisions about what's more important to them in their life. Now see, our idea of retirement is a plan that allows you to create promise-based income at a level that you don't have to worry every day about what's happening to the market. So it's to be worry-free as much as possible from market volatility so that you can stay focused on the reasons that you refired, the things that move your needle and float your boat. And here's another interesting statistic. There was a study done by the Society of Actuaries back in 2000, and they tested retirees that had promise-based income, basically pensions, for a 30-year time frame. And they studied longevity ages for that group of folks versus those that had no pension at all. And what they found was those that had a base of income they couldn't destroy, one they couldn't outlive, for whatever reason that group of people lived 2.5 years longer than the group that did not. I have a hypothesis on this that say if we can develop promise-based income from a base of your portfolio that coordinates for the income gap with Social Security and pension at a level that gives you enough essential income that makes the market volatility render less impact to positive or negative to your living standard, you'll just live longer because you'll die of old age. You'll not be dying out of the fear or the pressure of running out of income. And we call that retirement. So there are retirement decision points that are important for us to know, and some of these you might know. In fact, there may be a few of you that know them all. But the first one is, if I have a 401k plan and I'm not yet 59 and a half, traditionally we think that we have to be 59 and a half to be able to have access without a penalty tax to our 401k plan. And there is a special rule that was established a few years ago that say if you're 55 but not yet 59 and a half, the IRS allows you to take something called there is something called substantial equal payments, or 72T, which is what we call, it's a very stringent calculation that allows you to establish some income without penalty from your qualified assets. But this provision allows you to take what we call arbitrary distributions. So you can take none at the beginning, you can take some in a year or two, you can take less in 3 or 4 years, and so it gives you a lot of flexibility and variability of whether you take income or not from the 401k resources when you retire between that 55 and 59 and a half age without the constrainment of the 72T limitations. And so talk to your financial advisor about that for those of you who are retiring between 55 and 59 and a half. Now at 59 and a half, that's the year that no 10% penalty applies. Ordinary income tax does apply on your pre-tax dollars, your 403B, your 401k, your IRA, all pre-tax types of dollars. At 62, that's the earliest that one can take Social Security today. And then at 65 is when you're eligible for Medicare. Now you may automatically you automatically get Medicare Part A, but depending on whether you're working or still have health coverage through a spouse who's working at a group plan, you may defer Medicare Part B until you no longer have a group plan for which you're relying on health insurance that's equal to Medicare Part B. So again, another point of discussion with your financial advisor about what's best for you in terms of electing Medicare and whether you take both A and B at 65 and whether you're delaying Medicare Part B. Also, it's important to understand that Medicare Part B has tiering, and there's a special IRMAA tax that is applicable, and the more you make, the potentially higher the premiums to Medicare Part B. And there are certainly things that we can do to bring down what's counted for taxable income to keep your cash flows and your lifestyle standard as high as you want it while mitigating some of those higher tiering costs of Medicare Part B. Next is full Social Security benefit. Depending on the year you were born, depends on whether you take your full retirement at age 66 or 66 in a month or any months up to age 67. So again, there's a maximum age that you have to hit somewhere between 66 and 67 in order to get your full Social Security benefit. And you can delay for a higher benefit to not past age 70. And so that's another important age to remember. And then don't forget that at 70 and a half, on all of our pre-tax qualified assets such as 401k, IRA, 403B, Keogh plans, etc., we do have to start taking what is called required minimum distributions. For more information on that, again, refer to your financial advisor. So in retirement, there's rules and risk of change, and we need to understand the differences. In the working years, we're accumulating our money. In the retirement years, we're distributing from our nest egg. We're risk tolerant, and the older we get, maybe the more risk adverse we become. Our retirement date socially is known. Everybody retires around that 60, 65, 70-year time frame generally, but we have no idea for sure when we're going to die. It makes it difficult for us to actually map out a plan, and that's why setting some of these disciplines is so important. Maybe over time we've been open to many options, and then as we round out to our final phase of life in retirement, maybe I'm not sure the word less flexible is the right word, but certainly we're not as interested in taking all the risks and the options that maybe we were in our 20s, 30s, and 40s. And we are okay with a complex program. Some of us are, but certainly as we get older, we want to simplify as the risks of our mental faculties may diminish. We don't want anything that's too complicated, and especially when the first spouse dies and the surviving spouse is the only one left, we want to get closer and closer to simplifying our plan. The stages of life. So we have our working years, and then there's something called the preservation years. I want to introduce to you something called the red zone. The red zone is the 5 to 10 years before I retire and the 5 to 10 years after I retire. And what we do with preparing our money the 5 to 10 years before we retire to establish an income flow that's designed to protect against market variability for the 5 to 10 years after retire is critical. There was a researcher and an academic named Moshe Milevsky out of York University in Toronto, Canada, that did a study one time, and he found that those that have a 20% decline in equity markets, if the majority of their assets are in equities, in the 10 years before retirement or the 10 years after retirement, they have a 20% greater chance that they'll outrun their money if living 30 years. So that red zone becomes really important as we're investment allocating toward investment income for investments or investments for income, and it's really important that we focus on that 10 years before retirement. Well, this is not something we should be planning at retirement or a year before retirement. This is something we should be planning significantly in advance of when we're actually going to retire. And of course, then we have the retirement years and then the legacy years where we're trying to maintain retirement, and then hopefully we can leave something to those that we love at the end of the day. And I understand that's not a goal for everyone. Now I'm going to talk about something that we call blowing up the island of belief. And here's what it is. A lot of folks come to us and they have a certain opinion about what the performance of the equity markets or the markets will generally provide to them during retirement based on what they perceive their investments have done during the working years. And sometimes we'll have a client come in who says, well, I heard Dave Ramsey said 12%, and then maybe he lowered it to 10%, and I heard Clark Howard talk about a different number, or maybe it's 8 or 10%, but I've heard some really high numbers that consumers and pre-retirees have as expectations for what their portfolio will earn during retirement. Now remember, we have to constrain safely our mix between fixed income and growth and assets that are really focused on income, all while trying to grow our assets. And we may have some emergency fund dollars sitting in cash that's also for partial retirement. You may not be aware of what our entire composite yield is as we consider each portion of the portfolio that may be in different segments, earning different rates of return. And so in order to educate you on this island of belief that we're trying to blow up in terms of creating a reasonable expectation for performance, I want to share with you this source called Thornburg Investment Real World Return Study. Thornburg's been doing this study now for nearly 20 years, and they're always doing a back study of 30 years of the S&P 500. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner under the word growth, you're going to see this is the S&P 500 index. And you'll notice that it's going from 1984 to 2014. Now, we could look at a more recent pattern, we could look at an older pattern, and just understand it really doesn't matter what pattern we're looking at. The rate of return, the raw S&P, what we call nominal returns, are going to generate somewhere just above 12% or just below 12% consistently every 30-year tranche that we look at it. However, just because the nominal returns of the S&P may actually be 11 or 12 doesn't mean that we as retirees or we as American investors are going to experience 12%. It's misnomer. It's not true. And here's why. Because see, we can't get exactly what the S&P does because we don't know what they're buying, we don't know what they're selling, we don't know what strike price they're going to get on the sell, on the buy. And so we have to, in order to emulate the S&P, we have to actually go to a Vanguard or a Fidelity, and we have to utilize their expertise to try and do their best to emulate. Now, their best effort to emulate the S&P won't exactly match what the S&P does. It's just simply trying to mirror it as much as possible, but it's always doing so in arrears because they're learning about it after the decisions and the money has moved with the S&P board. So, you know, Fidelity and Vanguard don't do that for good looks. They don't do it for free. They do it for a fee. And so they're building in a fee drag here to this calculation based on what consumers would experience if they were to try to do some money in the S&P category. And then, assuming we had dividends and capital gains, the way the S&P is generating that, then we'd have a drag of income tax for dividends and income tax for long-term capital gains. And I understand that this is really relevant to long-term growth of after-tax money, not pre-tax or qualified money. Obviously, qualified money then becomes taxed at the distribution phase during our retirement years as we get a pre-tax deduction on the way in. Taxes are going to be true regardless of whether we have qualified dollars that are after tax or we have after-tax dollars that are unqualified. So taxes are going to be an issue. And then the third and final element that's being calculated here is the 3% inflation factor. So when they adjust this for fees, taxes, and inflation, I want you to see over 30 years what the actual real return is. The real return is about 6%. Now, I want you to notice something. When I say 6%, I'm going to surprise you when I say hardly no one gets 6%. And you may say, well, I don't understand. It says 6% on this report. How is it that we would not be getting 6%? Well, let me explain. You understand on the far left-hand side, this is illustrating a single deposit. It means that all of the money that you would need 30 years from now, you would have deposited at the front end. How many people do you know that has all the money they need 30 years in advance? This does not add in another deposit. It's a single deposit 30 years in advance with no additional deposits and no withdrawals the whole time. And then secondly, if they did have all the money that I needed 30 years in advance, I would put it all 100% in the S&P 500, no diversification. Well, I don't really know anybody that is that aggressive that if they in fact did have all the money they needed discounted 30 years in advance, that they would put it all in the S&P 500. I don't know anybody that would do that. And thirdly, it doesn't matter how bad the market got along the way in its market dips, in the second half of the 30-year tranche of time. And the closer I got to the finish line, which we're going to call retirement in this case, I didn't flinch. In other words, I never got scared and I never sold out, or I always had the courage to stay the course. There's not very many people that I know that could do that, despite the fact that the market was responding the way that it was responding over the second half of this 30-year time frame. So, in other words, the only way you would have gotten the 6% is for those three things to be true, and probably none of them are true for most of us. And the reason for that is this. We call this, people buy when they shouldn't buy. There's subliminal fear, there's subliminal greed, and they have this emotion commotion that we're going to talk about. As a matter of fact, there's another study that was done called the Dalbar study, and this study was a measurement of consumer behavior. So it's the same 30-year period as we illustrated during the Thornburg Investment River Return Study, only this is testing average returns based on what average clients do. So this 3-year period is the last 3 years of that 30-year period, so 2012, 13, and 14, and then the 5-year period before the end of that 30-year tranche, the 10-year period, the 20-year period, and the 30-year period. So let's take a look at 12, 13, and 14, 2012, 13, and 14. You can see that the S&P 500 index, the time-weighted returns were 20.41%. But if we look at the average equity investor in America during that same 3-year period, based on the dollar-weighted returns, their average return was $14.82. Now you may say, well, Curtis, that seems to be a really good rate of return. And as a matter of fact, it is. But it certainly isn't what the raw S&P did. Now let's take a look at the Barclays Bond Index. And you can see the raw index did 266, but the average bond investor only did 0.72. You know, most people aren't going to just do bonds, or they're not going to just do equities. So we're going to assume that an average consumer is more likely to have more a 50-50 blend of equity or bond or fixed type income instruments. And if we were to look at what the 50% of the performance of equities for an average American versus 50% of bonds for an average American, and we average that out based on that blend of 50-50 for the 3 years, we'd end up over that 3-year period with a 7.77% rate of return. Now we do the same exercise and we look at it over a 5-year period, you can see we have 5.65%. If we do it over 10 years, as we extend duration, it gets worse and worse. Now we're down to 298. If we do it over 20, we actually bumped up to 3%. But when I do a 30-year duration, and this is pretty consistent with all 30-year tranches, I'm down to 2.26%. Now understand that most consumers have this belief that they're generating 7-8% on their portfolio. Now they may have a very small portion of their portfolio, or 20 or 30% of their portfolio generating years of really positive returns. But when we look and put that together with their entire portfolio, we stretch that out over good years and bad years, they just are not able to do that calculation. Now this report is very careful in the footnotes to indicate that when a financial advisor that knows what they're doing is involved, the consumers will generate about double the return that they would get if they were on their own. So if I use that 226, somewhere in the 4.5% to 5% range is generally what we can expect a general consumer to be making on their portfolio. And if they're paying an advisor 1% to manage their portfolio, or a mutual fund company, or if there are fees inside their 401k, then you've got to gross up, there may be a gross of 6 to get in that of 5. But most pre-retirees and consumers are overthinking and overstating the belief that their performance of their portfolio is going to make. Now understand, this chart is about accumulation. This is not during period of distribution. So during distribution, we have new pressures that make this even more at risk than during the accumulation phases. So there are 5 critical risks that we now want to educate you. Of all the 18 risks that exist, here are the 5 most critical risks that we need to work on first to mitigate. The first risk is longevity risk. See, a husband and wife age 65 years of age have a 50% chance that one of them will live to 93, 25% chance that one of them will live to 98. And the longer we go with medical technology, the longer we're living. One other interesting statistic about this particular issue of longevity is, based on the 2012 mortality tables, those Americans who made it to age 65, men on average lived to 86.6, women lived on average to 88.8. Understand that those averages are averages, means that 50% of the genders died before they got to those ages and 50% lived longer. So if we just simply build a retirement plan based on those averages, we have a 50-50 chance of success or failure. Pretty sure that's not good enough for any of us. We wouldn't want to build anything for retirement that was a 50-50 chance of success or failure. And especially when I have 2 people, the chances of one of them living longer than those average ages is much greater, that 2 people, one of them will live longer than what the averages of the individual genders are. So we have to be really mindful that we've got to build these retirement plans to last a very long time. Next is inflation risk. And inflation's been a fact of life. And things that we buy, milk and bread and cars, they just go up. And I don't think there's a debate or any argument about the fact that we must put inflation into the plan. Next is healthcare risks. And I want to not talk just about long-term care risks that happen at the end of life. I want to talk about just regular health insurance after we retire. well, Medicare Part B premium, the Medicare Supplement or Medicare Advantage premiums, the Medicare Part D premiums for the medications, the out-of-pocket expenses that we'll have for the donut hole and deductibles and things if we have an Advantage plan. And so this chart really shows us that we'll spend about $47.34 a year if we average it out between 65 and 85 for healthcare costs. Some of that is going to be covered by health insurance if we pick good health insurance products. 42% of this is premiums, 58% of this is actual services. And so if we buy great health insurance products, the right kind, if you work with your advisor and he works with his specialist on the health insurance side to help you select the proper health insurance products, those health insurance products will help mitigate a lot of the cost of health care during your retirement years. What we're really talking about, though, is the increased cost of the premium. And so we're going to see a 5 to 6% increase to premiums for Medicare supplements, Medicare Part B, or maybe even higher. And so we have to dial in a different inflation assumption on the increasing cost of medical premiums and out-of-pocket costs than we do to other lifestyle needs and other essential income needs, such as housing, food, gas, and so forth. The fourth critical risk is kind of a silent giant here. It's one that we haven't heard of much. It's a withdrawal risk. It's a sequence of returns risk or excessive withdrawal risk. And so we're going to take a look at an example of what this really is representing. So let's pretend for a minute that I have a client with $250,000. They're 35 years of age and they've got 30 years to let their money grow. Now what I've done in column 2 is I've created a positive early return, positive returns. You can see the pattern or order of returns, where at the last 3 years of this pattern of returns, I had some really bad rates of return. The average of those returns when I average the 30 years out is 7%. And so we're going to start here with Tom, and that accumulates to $1.9 million, pretty good sum of money. And then we're going to talk about Susan over here. And instead of the pattern of returns being what we illustrated with Tom, we're going to just turn the pattern or the order of returns upside down so that the negative returns were on top and the good returns are on the bottom. And we kept every number that was in the column 2. In column 3, we just changed the order of them. So that means we have the same 7% average return, and consequently, we have the same $1.9 million. So it really doesn't matter when I'm accumulating money what the order or pattern of returns are. I will have exactly the same amount of money while I'm accumulating money. Well, here's the problem. The problem is when I go from accumulation to distribution, and that only happens during retirement. Now we're going to advance Tom and Susan to age 65. They have the same $250,000. However, they're going to request that we provide to them a 5% withdrawal based on their $250,000. So at 64, they come and say, hey, in 65, I'm retiring, give me 5%. 5%, $250,000 will be $12,500. If I increase that annually 3% to keep pace with 3% inflation, that's $12,875. And I'm going to continue to inflate that 3% each year through 30 years. So at 94, 30 years later, I'm going to be almost at $30,000 a year. And so I still have the same pattern order of returns for Tom. Good returns along the front end of retirement and bad returns at the end of retirement, the same 7% average. And Tom's going to end up with $712,000 taking those income draws out of that portfolio. Now you might say, Kurt, that looks pretty good to me. Started with $250, nearly tripled his assets. He had a 5% withdrawal, 3% inflation. Looks like he did pretty good. I'd retire under those sets of circumstances, and so would I. But here's the part we don't know. We don't know what the order or pattern of returns is going to be until after we've pulled the trigger of retirement. So now we're going to look at what happens to Susan. See, Susan has bad returns as we change the order of returns. And by the way, with 30 numbers, there's literally thousands of iteration opportunities that we could reorder this. And the outcome of whether money would last or not would depend on what order of those numbers that we did based on 30 numbers. In this particular order, where we just simply reverse the numbers to an upside down order, Susan would run out of money at age 82. She'd run out of money before she'd run out of breath. And so even though the average returns are still 7 based on the pattern of returns, In the earlier years, Susan lost so much principal of her investment, she had to sell losses, that when the markets recovered, she didn't have the ability to recover. And once you start cannibalizing equity or principal, it's a slippery slope if you last a long time. So this is something we call sequence of returns or order of returns risk, and many consumers don't understand. Now, I need you to understand this is not about average returns, because average returns will not reflect the likelihood of the safety or the predictability of how long a portfolio will last. Also want to show you what happens in longevity, and I want to show you that longevity risk is the #1 risk in retirement. This is titled "What a Difference a Single Year Would Make." So this 65-year-old couple with $1 million, and we've invested 80% in equities, 20% in fixed income, assuming that 5% withdrawal, which so many want to use, and increased rate based on 3% inflation, 30-year rolling time frames, and the question is, will it last 30 years? So I want you to see this slide. Along the bottom of the slide, this axis, along the bottom, you're going to see 1926, and following that clear over to the right-hand side, you're going to see 1984. So this is representing a husband and wife, a couple with $1 million portfolio who's retiring at 65, and they're lasting 30 years. So 1926, we're retiring them at age 65, and we're making them live to 95, and we're doing that every year, 1927, 28, 29, 30. Now obviously for space on this slide, we only listed every other year, but it really represents every year from 1926 to 1984. When I get clear over to the right-hand side, 1984, if I last 30 years in retirement at age 65 to 95, I'm getting my couple to all the way to January of 2014. So I want you to understand that this is a fairly recent chart. This gets me all the way to 2014. Now what you're going to see next are green bars. Those green bars represent the years based on back testing what an 80-20 mix would have done, taking a 5% withdrawal drag, a 3% increase for inflation, whether or not they would have run out of money. And all of these bars represent the years you could have retired where you would not have run out. At least there'd be a penny left in the portfolio. We don't know if there's $1, whether there's $1 million, we just know they didn't run out. The red bars tell us where they would have run out, and it tells us exactly where they would have run out. Now here's the point that we want to make. Back when people didn't live as long as they live today, let's pretend that they only lived 10 years in retirement. You see, if we retire at 65 and we live to 75 and we only last 10 years, it didn't matter what interest rates did, what inflation did, it just simply didn't matter. When we back test this from 1926 to 2014, what we find is that we just never run out of money. As soon as we add 10 years of duration, a 32% chance of failure. I'm pretty sure if you came to the meeting today with your advisor and you came in a car and there was a 30% chance that you weren't going to make it home, you'd probably find a way to stay at the advisor's office today. You wouldn't get in an airplane and fly across the country, and you certainly wouldn't get on a table and go under the knife. There's just a lot of things in life we wouldn't do with a 32% chance of failure. Now see what happens when we add 30 years of duration. It's a 59% chance of failure. And here's the reality. We can't do retirement as we once did. Why? Markets aren't responding the way they used to respond. Why? Technology. Medical technology is keeping us alive longer and longer with better quality of life. Technology is also causing markets not to respond the way they once did because we have powerful algorithms and powerful computer programs. And we can automate so much of what happens to the market as the daily market climbs and goes back down. And therefore, we have a lot of technology-based triggering of the markets going on. So we can't buy and hold the way we used to buy and hold. Markets simply don't work in the way or the same way that they once did. We're now in the 21st century, longevity in the 21st century markets. And we have new black swans that are really going to be lurking at our heels. So we have to realize that we can't do what we've always done in the way we used to do it. Remember back in the day, for years and years, we could have bond portfolios that would generate 5 and 6% consistently. And today we could never count on a bond yield generating that kind of consistent income. It's just a different day. We'll probably not see interest rates rise ever to the level during our lifetime that we once saw, just because, can you imagine what would break in your life are the things around you. If we had a 6% 10-year treasury. Not saying we wouldn't see a 6% 10-year treasury. I'm just suggesting to you that with the government's debt and the things that we rely on for debt these days, we just can't tolerate as a society the same kinds of inflation, or we can't tolerate the same kind of interest rates that maybe we did at one time. There's going to be a change of the landscape, and things are definitely moving. And so the final and the fifth of these 5 critical risks is market risk, or market volatility. And you might say, well, Curtis, I thought we just talked about that. No, we talked about sequence of returns risk. Market volatility is quite a different matter. And let me demonstrate what I mean. You see, if I were to give each of you $100,000, and I would also offer you an investment portfolio scenario A, an investment portfolio scenario B, and I in advance of the 5 years tell you what the performance would be, and say which of the 2 investment scenarios would you like to pick, A or B. I'm even going to give you a hint. If I do the average returns, scenario A has an average return of 6.4. Scenario B has an average return of 6%. Which would you pick, A or B? Well, interestingly enough, if I picked A, I'd have $400 less, even though it has a higher average return than if I would have picked B. And so general consumers simply don't understand the true effective rate of math. It's not the average rate, it's the effective rate that really lends itself to what I can expect over time. And so this is a chart here on the far right that says if I lose 30%, takes almost 43% off of the bottom to get back to even. If I lose 50%, takes 100% off the bottom to get back to even. And so it's just hard for us to understand and quantify that math. See that negative 12% under scenario A? That was a loss of 12% on $130,000, not a loss of 12% on the original 100, because we had 3 positive years of growth that grew that 100 to 130. We also need to be careful about the red zone we talked about in a previous slide. So just to round out the understanding, the average returns don't matter, so we're going to unveil the truth behind average returns. Imagine for a minute I had $1,000 and I averaged 20% for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, the question is, how much would I have? Let me pause while you think about that for just a moment. Well, let's do the math together. If I did 20% on 1,000 for the first year, that's 200, so that'd be 1,200. Now I have $1,200. If it grows 20%, that's going to give me $240. Now I'm going to have $1,440. So if I average 20% for those 2 years, I in fact would have $1,440. But what if I was up 60% and the next year I was down 20? I still averaged 20, but I only have $1,280. If I was up 100 but now down 60, I still averaged 20%, but I only have $800. Now I've seen this in farming with commodities. What if I was up 140? I lost it all 100%. I could argue I averaged 20, but I don't have any money left. And so this is just a method, an exercise to get you to understand you cannot bank on average returns. It's the effective returns that matter. See, creating a retirement plan is very complex, many goals to achieve, which is why you don't want to go home and try it alone. You have a guaranteed income or promise-based income goals. You have inflation you want to meet or beat. You want to minimize taxes. You want to max returns, but not too much risk. And don't forget about that surviving spouse. Now, the advisors in the room have been trained specifically to utilize this educational tool of the 5 fears and 5 risks. And additionally, they're using a program to do the analytics called Retirement Next Gen. Retirement Next Gen not only calculates the numbers for the financial needs, but this process also talks about and gets you to think about the emotional needs that you have. Now, a lot of folks learn in different ways, sometimes audibly, sometimes visually, and sometimes analytically. And so what we've done with R&G is put together all of those learning styles together in a single approach. And what we basically do, the Thrive retirement process, takes all the assets in your nest egg of retirement portfolio assets, and it divides them in 2 distinct camps. We want to separate the minimum amount of assets necessary to add promise-based income to your portfolio to supplement your Social Security pension and other income resources to create an essential income floor called a paycheck. It's going to be a replacement to the paycheck you were getting while you were working. See, we can calculate those 5 years before retirement, 10 years before retirement. We can calculate them at any time, and we can quantify the value of the assets needed to create a specified amount of income stream. We can do that with precision. Any amount of dollars that are not necessary after that create what we call a play check. Now, what I first need is reliable and predictable income. Any amount of money I don't need for that promise-based income floor is now for the purposes of liquidity, discretionary income, the play check. This is excess income. I only take it when the market's up. I don't have to take it when the market's down because it's not essential expenses. I'm focused on growth and legacy, and here I've given more permission to chase equities faster, and I've taken those assets away from the risk of the red zone because I've created this floor of income. And so this creates a defensive team and an offensive team so that I can play both offense and defense. This is an example of the visual dashboard in the Retirement Next Gen software. And as you can see here, the red line represents the entire portfolio on a linear calculation of a particular case study based on taxes and inflation and fees and the composition of their assets. And the green line represents how this advisor was able to substantially improve the assets that their heirs would enjoy and the assets that they would enjoy during their lifetime. If I look at the far right, you can see our withdrawal rate or our withdrawal drag. Our goal in this case was the discipline that we set in the discovery during the special fact gathering session was to try to keep our distribution rate as much as possible at or below 3%. And you can see that as they come in the door, the way they were as they walked into the advisor's office when calculated, they weren't too bad. Their average was pretty good, but there were periods of time really early. That's the red zone period where they were actually above a 3% drag. Now, this wasn't necessarily a bad plan, the red line over in the withdrawal rate column, but we significantly improved that with the green line, as you can see. So we de-risked this portfolio substantially, all while increasing performance. So we didn't sacrifice any performance, but we made the safety of the plan much better. Thirdly, on the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the term reliability of income. And what you can see is our average reliability was somewhere in the 60% range, and we substantially increased it to 80%. So the promise-based income went up substantially. And here's the most important thing, is not only did we create safety, improve performance, but we created a lot of additional free assets. We freed up a lot of additional assets for discretionary liquidity during those periods of time. We either wanted to help our kids or give to charity or simply have a play check. The things that we didn't plan to do, they just are things we wanted to do as we went through retirement. And so these are all the things that we want. We want more performance, we want safer retirement expectations, we want the joy, the utility, and the happiness that retirement can bring, and we want to have plenty of discretionary flexibility to move about as times change. So Social Security is one of the things that we must test. There's a 5-dimensional test. For Social Security, most programs are only testing 3 dimensions. We do all 5-dimensional testing. Also, pensions require a 3-dimensional test. They're based on a husband and wife if there is a couple. Or a companion couple, we simply need to understand what the longevity is and what the limitations are of those different pension plans, and make sure that based upon what it is the goals of that couple that we're maximizing, not just for one, for both of them, lifestyle and income for the mutual lifetimes. And so what's the process? The process is to first of all collect and gather the client data, your goals, your income sources, and your assets. And then next, we coordinate all the various assets that you've acquired. And for income sources, Social Security pension, rental income, required withdrawals, taxable accounts, and reposition assets to maximize income and tax efficiency. So we coordinate. Next, we control all the cash flows to give you both the paycheck and the play check. We create a promise-based series of income sources. And finally, your financial advisor, as we round this conversation, will talk to you about what the cost to engage the next step of the process. This is a 3-meeting process. The first meeting is a purely educational discussion, talking about the 5 fears and 5 risks, and this is a session that is provided free of charge for meeting with the advisor today. If you want to engage the next phase, which is discovery, collecting your all of your assets and resources, and then identifying your goal for retirement and what we call the movie you're playing in your mind, and then your advisor will plug all that data in. The third meeting is to share the dashboard and the results of how it looks the day you walk in the door to the advisor office, and how it might look after a series of tests have been done, and then stress test against bad times and good times, not just a linear test, to say which is the most optimal, what takes the most risk off the plate, gives you the greatest performance and the greatest amount of discretionary liquidity and flexibility. So we hope you can see yourself in the power of Thrive. This is a client-driven process designed specifically for pre-retirees and retirees. We thank you for joining us today, because our desire is to help you refire with confidence.